Good afternoon, and welcome to the celebration for the 2022 Grawemeyer Award in Education. Whether you are attending in person, virtually, or watching an archived version of this event, we are grateful for your interest and support of the University of Louisville's Grawemeyer Award in Education. The Grawemeyer Award in Education was first established in 1988 by H. Charles Grawemeyer. Its purpose is to stimulate ideas that have potential to bring about significant improvement in educational practice and attainment. In addition to the recognition and promotion of outstanding academic work, the award carries a $100,000 prize. Each year, the Grawemeyer Award in Education receives dozens of nominations from all over the world. As you can imagine, agreeing on a winner requires the dedicated work of many people. So before we begin, I would like to extend my thanks to the following: the Grawemeyer family, for their continued support of this award; the members of the CEHD faculty who devoted so much time and expertise carefully reading the nominated works; and to the members of the community who ultimately made a recommendation to the Board of Trustees. With that, it is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Rucker C. Johnson, the 2021 winner of the Grawemeyer Award in Education. Dr. Johnson is an economist and the Chancellor's Professor in the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California-Berkeley, and a faculty research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Among his many honors, Dr. Johnson is the Sir Arthur Lewis Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Education. He is awarded the Grawemeyer Award in Education for the contributions as author of Children of the Dream: Why School Integration Works, which was co-published in 2019 by Basic Books and the Russell Sage Foundation. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Johnson here today, along with his mother and stepfather, Dr. Johnson Dean and Dr. Dean. I am thrilled for him to talk today about his book, his research broadly, and the impact on schools across the nation. This work truly highlights the urgency of addressing unequal educational opportunity in our country, and I can't wait to hear more from Dr. Johnson today. Welcome to the University of Louisville, Dr. Johnson.
Great, so I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I want to thank the Dean. I want to thank the University of Louisville faculty for this tremendous honor. I especially want to thank the Grawemeyer family, the director of the Grawemeyer Award this year, Jeff Valentine, the tremendous Southern hospitality for welcoming me here to your wonderful community. I'm really excited about this moment in our nation's history, but also how we can promote the ways in which school quality represent an engine of opportunity and upward mobility for children, not just in the past, but in the ways that we think about our collective future. I believe it was DEI strategist Arthur Chan who once said, "Diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, and belonging is an outcome." Now, what we're adding to that today is that policy is the bridge that connects resources to opportunity for making it happen for today's children. And those require strategic and intentional choices around how we make the living reality for millions of children to be consistent with that set of opportunity. Too often, however, not sure why that's happening, okay? Too often, however, that reality is being stolen from the ways in which segregation is often hoarding opportunity in ways that are not allowing children to reach their potential. The prevailing high levels of segregation have undermined the reality of equal educational opportunity in ways that the single biggest driver of racial differences in upward mobility prospects for children are connected to the ways segregation has often hampered that reality. Now, what we're kind of also focusing on is that historically, school funding mechanisms for the ways in which schools are able to thrive have often been implicitly tied to longstanding assumptions about which communities and students are deserving of adequate educational investments, who has the greatest capacity to learn, and which students we set high expectations for and hold to high standards versus low expectations and low standards. And so when we think about school segregation and unequal school resources, they really represent the nerve center of inequitable educational opportunity and often perpetuate structural racism in ways that aren't necessarily about having racist intentions, but the systems-based approach to inequality often have the inequities baked in. And so we want to think about the intersection of race and class, the intersections of pre-K and K-12 access, the intersections of public education and health investments, and ways in which the essential ways that we invest in our kids and the policy prescriptions for sustainable equity-based reform require action today that we can draw on the lessons from past research. Now, I want to kind of maybe as a guiding theme, remind us also that, as John Dewey once said, democracy has to be reborn in every generation, and education is its midwife. Now, there's a lot of arguments around this talk being given right here in Louisville that has been a national model for how we both confront the challenges of integration, but also how we, as a community, how Louisville has been a significant leader in fueling having a metropolitan-wide integration plan that has been sustained in many turbulent periods. I think it's only fitting then that we think about the myths that often frame school desegregation as a failed social experiment, that school spending doesn't matter or pre-K is an ineffective treatment for longer term outcomes. Those thoughts that we tried integration for a long time, it didn't work, that it's no longer relevant, that the first pieces are we didn't try it for a long time as a nation, 15 years really in a window of period. Louisville actually is distinctive in having a much longer commitment in that. The idea that it didn't work, I wouldn't be here, obviously, if I couldn't present some evidence to remind us of the ways in which it has worked. Now, the ways in which it's no longer relevant is highly relevant today in our multiracial environment. And our school children has never been more multiracial, ethnically diverse. This generation's cohort of children need to be prepared for a world that they inherit that's inherently global and multiracial and multicultural. The question is, are we preparing them for that real reality? Now, part of this requires not just integration as an idea, but actually as an approach to the policies themselves, that interlocking problems require interlocking solutions, that every problem magnifies the impact of the others, and they're also tightly connected. That is the health aspects, the educational aspects, the socio-emotional learning, the teacher quality, the aspects that have to do with class size and per pupil spending, that all of these are so connected that one reversal can produce a chain reaction with results far distant from the original cause. And too often, the extant efforts at solving some of the educational inequities. I'm talking about some of the gaping achievement gaps by race and class. I'm talking about the ways in which we often detach the health from the educational prescriptions. We often detach the early education investments from the K-12 investments, not recognizing that it's only if we correct the silos, that current policy designs are as divided as many of our segregated classrooms and must be combated just as vehemently. So what I want you to kind of remember, if we think about data as a time machine, is recall that the period in which we saw the biggest convergence in the black-white achievement gap is among cohorts that experienced the biggest exposure to integration. It is these cohorts born between 1960 and 1985, where we reached peak integration levels in the late 80s. And there was a significant 40% decline in the black-white achievement gap that we witnessed. A lot of times people will kind of make points that educational investments have increased dramatically and that there's a stubborn kind of achievement or stagnant achievement, and use that kind of time series argument to suggest education spending is an inadequate policy prescription for the things that have to do with school resource equity issues. What I want to kind of first describe is that actually is not consistent in any way with the actual evidence. Now, what I want to kind of highlight is the kind of life course perspective of how we are connecting the ways in which, from an intergenerational perspective, the racial pieces gets encoded into the opportunity structure. So racial stigma, neighborhood segregation often is fueled from some of that. That leads to many of the school segregation components that then affect college preparedness, that then affect access to higher education, not just at the University of Louisville, but all across this country. That then affects the success and the critical skills for successful learning that then translate into labor market outcomes and differences in them, and all of those pieces that many of the kind of early antecedents to criminal involvement are access or confinement to a poorly functioning education system. These are all things that then systematically affect the intergenerational transmission of economic status and occupational status, and then that process then has a way of reproducing in the next generation. What we're kind of really just trying to describe is within each of these arrows, there is a set of policy prescriptions and interventions that can alleviate the school segregation that's leading to disparities in achievement, that then is leading to disparities in access to higher education, that's then leading to the labor market disparities and the disparities in criminal justice. There's a way to think about how we intervene. Brown v. Board was the beginning of that kind of fulfillment of that civil rights movement. But the Fair Housing Acts, the integration, the school funding reform so that there's equitable investments. But it's not just those pieces, right? It's the Section 8 housing and how we leverage the housing subsidies, how we design them to have access to more opportunity-rich areas, how we think about affirmative action to remedy some of the legacy of past harms, well, how we think about anti-discrimination enforcement. I'm talking about job training programs. I'm talking about rethinking sentencing form from a more rehabilitative approach. I'm talking about minimum wage and living wage ordinances. And I'm also talking about the stability and the generosity of our safety net. Now, the whole point of this is I'm not coming with a set of problems, but a set of solution-oriented evidence about what and ways that when we use data as a time machine, what lessons are relevant for today's policy choices. Now, you can certainly go back and use data as a time machine and remember on the eve of 1954, the regional pattern of where legal segregation was required, permitted, prohibited, and you see that here, that you all are well familiar with. What I want to just highlight here is the timing of the school desegregation efforts, because that allows us actually to then use that timing. That notice the first decade after Brown, there was very little actual integration efforts being successful. The 64 civil rights put teeth in enforcement. 1975 was a particular important year for this community in Louisville. The first major court-ordered school desegregation efforts were launched in 1975. What I want you to see is this scattering of plots where we see where integration efforts began to take hold. And then in the early 90s, there began a series of kind of resegregation and movements away from strategically prioritizing integration efforts, with the culmination of the Parents Involved case, 2007, that obviously involved Louisville, Seattle. The point is, we're trying to use this timing over a 40-year period, assemble the data to get at the school conditions that transpired and follow 3 generations of children from birth to adulthood to link how their childhood conditions affected their subsequent outcomes. Now, so we go back in history, this is what it was in Jefferson County, right? This is the plan. You had to tell when your child will be bused. It was based on the child's last name. You can see if the child's last name begins with these letters, then they were bused in certain grades. Now, this kind of procedure actually allows researchers to go back to that data and have that kind of quasi-experimental randomization of the timing at which you actually were bused. That was random and actually creates the kind of fertile conditions for an experimental design approach to look at when children were exposed to more integrated environments, but they were otherwise similar children that had the same background, but were not bused or were not in having access to schools that had better resources. What were the impacts? And again, because of this timing where you can look at the children's last name, Cody Tuttle is a researcher that was able to use this data that really complements the design that I do with nationally representative data to show what the impacts were for Louisville. And in my book, we really try to use the quantitative data to get an aerial view of what the actual experiences were for kids. This is, for example, the first integrated cohort of Chicago public schools, Avalon Elementary School. I want to first highlight, for example, Dr. Paul Gorin. He has been superintendent, got his doctorate at Stanford University's education program, went on to become superintendent, leading principal in Minneapolis, superintendent Evanston. When you talk to Dr. Paul Gorin, he talks about these integration experiences as the formative reasons that launched his why to what his whole career, life's work has been about. His classmate, Dr. Forrest Jones, would go on to become the first doctor to desegregate Chicago area hospitals. The point is their families would develop a relationship, a bond, through the experience and the challenges of integration. But what I want you to see is this was his kindergarten cohort. Notice 1964. Notice 1967, Paul Gorin's still smiling over here. But notice how the rest of his classmates noticeably lost a lot of the white classmates. And you can see by the 5th and 6th grade year, you still see Paul Gorin at the front of the class, right? But you just notice that the white flight was a part of what actually transpired in many districts. This is Dorothy Count Scoggins, the first to integrate Charlotte Public Schools. This is Dewania Kyles, the first to integrate Memphis. I mean, these are living history before us, but where we wanted to get the qualitative picture and join it with the quantitative evidence that I was able to gather. Now the point is, before the court orders, there was very little actual reduction in school segregation, but after them we saw pretty dramatic, significant decreases in racial school segregation, even with white flight. And a lot of that actually resulted in significant per pupil spending increases for black children, because a lot of the district level spending had been disproportionately allocated to the majority white schools within the district. That really changed. I'm talking about like a 20% increase in per pupil spending. That translated into significant access to better educational opportunities, that we then witnessed a significant increase in every additional year of exposure to integration. We saw black children born between 1960 and 1975 who've been followed to the present, were able to document the impacts on their educational attainment, so that by, say, the early to mid 80s, 18 and 19-year-olds college going rates among black 18 and 19-year-olds had reached the same levels as white 18, 19-year-olds. And we document that the integration efforts were a major catalyst in that racial convergence. There's no other period in our time, in our history, where the convergence on educational outcomes, on economic outcomes, I'm talking about earnings, and on health outcomes converged at this level as this period of the integration period. We saw it also be transmitted in earnings, not just in educational attainment, where we see a significant increase, but with each additional year of exposure to integrated schools, we saw about a 3 to 5% increase in wages in adulthood, so that children that were exposed to integration throughout their school age years witnessed about a 30% increase in earnings relative to otherwise similar children from those same districts and for those same school communities among the earlier cohorts that were confined to all segregated schools. Now, all of that then translated into a significant reduction in the annual incidence of poverty in adulthood. We're talking about a 20 percentage point decline. What I want you to see throughout these results that I'm trying to document is it is not a zero-sum game. these benefits that we saw experienced for African Americans did not come at the expense of whites. We did not see any evidence of negative impacts on whites on any of the outcomes, and actually on outcomes that relate to reductions in racial prejudice and increases in racial tolerance, reductions in racial intolerance, and actually a lessening of political polarization. We see that when children are exposed to more diverse communities, particularly non-Hispanic white children, we see that in adulthood, they actually express in their racial attitudes and in their political views a much more, I don't mean progressive in the political Republican Democratic sense. I mean in the sense of when asked about policies that have to do with equity, when asked about their attitudes toward different racial ethnic groups that are different from them, when asked about socioeconomic difference, that there's a noticeable difference in their statements around those issues when asked in adulthood, and then linking it to their exposure to diverse settings in childhood. So we want to kind of highlight that when we think about criminal justice policy, our most effective instruments are actually within the educational institutions. We see a significant reduction in incarceration for Black men in particular, associated with when they were exposed to more integrated environments. Now, this is not like an easy thing to implement. Louisville's communities knows for many decades how difficult and politically charged these issues can be. And that it's not enough to have a racially cosmetic appearance of diversity on the outside, and then only to discover on the inside of desegregated schools, segregated classrooms where people are tracked as early as 3rd grade into college preparatory tracks versus more remedial and non-college preparatory tracks before they're even able to exhibit their talent and capacity to learn. So we want to think about how we are structuring your trajectory from taking algebra to taking trigonometry, to then being ready to take calculus in high school. That we're not going to have future engineers. We're not going to have future people going into STEM as long as we are not preparing, and as long as 1/3 of public high schools with a significant minority enrollment don't even offer calculus in high school. We're not going to have the curricular offerings. We're not going to have a multicultural set of community civic-minded leaders if we have legislation that is systematically restricting how an honest conversation about our racial history can be learned within the K-12 school community. Now, I'm saying all of this to say diversity, integration is not a single thing. It's not about student school assignment, but it's also about teacher diversity, racial diversity of teachers. It's also about school resource equity. It's about per pupil spending, class size, guidance counselors, mental health practitioners. It's also about multicultural and curricular diversity, right? These are the ingredients that middle-class families are leaning into, that school choice is requiring wealth to be able to exercise that choice. And the question is that how we should be guiding access to opportunity that require wealth in the housing market to ration opportunity? We want to consider the contemporary issues and the contemporary policy influences on school segregation. I mean, some of the unregulated charter school growth that can sometimes reinforce school segregation. I'm talking about sometimes the intentional gerrymandering of school district boundaries to create exclusion and hoarding of opportunity. I'm talking about racialized tracking. Now, again, the Louisville community has been a significant leader in these respects. But even some of our communities that have a decorated history of success have at times, in other places, sometimes had moments where the movement has been a regression backwards. And so we want to think about how the zoning policies, how the housing subsidies, how the real estate practices and mortgage lending, how all of those things can bleed into the access and functioning of our educational systems, and recognize this past history of restrictive covenants, segregated housing projects, transportation infrastructure that was divisive. That history is past, but not so past from it being connected to our present. Now, what I want to kind of highlight is a lot of the work that people think about is focused on academic achievement as measured by test scores. What I kind of want to also underscore, as Martin King put it more eloquently, the contact hypothesis posits that when people fail to get along because they fear each other, they fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. There is a particular period of childhood, of adolescence, of elementary school and middle school and elementary and into high school, that if we design our systems to give children an opportunity to learn across difference, to be able to understand differences of perspective, to have intellectual spaces where people disagree, and it be a healthy debate that can actually be something that breaks down the generational divide, in other words, we had court orders because we recognized the older generation was stuck and not willing to move forward. But the court orders weren't meant to be permanent. Eventually, the hope was that the next generation would have voluntary integration efforts. The purpose wasn't to have court orders indefinitely. The idea was that proof can come after the mandate. That if you have a set of generation of children that experiences integration, that they will be converted about its value, that diversity is a value that is best understood through experience. And if the older generation doesn't have that experience, they may not be able to weigh in the most effective way to then change and alter the generation for the future. This is our moment to be able to transmit that set of opportunities to the future cohorts of children if we recognize the opportunity before us. Now, what I want to kind of first also highlight is that you can't do this without a very strong commitment to school resource equity, and that requires federal, state, and local investment. And so I just want to highlight that when we look at spending disparities between rich and poor districts, a lot of the most concentrated poverty districts have higher special needs, higher proportions of English language learners, have higher proportions of many features that make educational opportunity provision more costly. But in many state systems, they actually don't get adequate resources to meet those needs. What we want to kind of think about is how the school resources and the adequacy of the funding formula affect the actual achievement gap. This is an example that's drawn for the entire country. And what you see from left to right is, from the left, the most disadvantaged socioeconomically districts to the most affluent. Every school district in the country is on this one figure with circles that represent the size of that local enrollment. What I just want you to see is Massachusetts has one of the most progressive and was one of the highest per pupil spending districts. And you can see that in contrast to California, this is before 2013, before California embraced a major school funding reform, progressive funding formula, but at the time, their level of achievement for every, say, level of socioeconomic advantage or socioeconomic status, you can see the red dots higher than the white dots, where the outcome here is an average achievement, where you can see the most affluent students are performing at 2 and 3 grade level equivalents greater than the more socioeconomically disadvantaged students in socioeconomically disadvantaged districts. A part of that is affected by the actual progressivity and adequacy of the funding formula. And we saw this in California. California changed their funding formula. This is before the change. Over the next 7 years, 2013 to 2020, we saw a major 7-year commitment, an $18 billion commitment. This funding formula basically had an explicit requirement of spending more in more disadvantaged districts, that reduce class sizes, that increase teacher salaries, that reduce teacher turnover and administrative turnover, led to significant increases in guidance counselors, health services. I would say that administrative salaries is not as essential, but the point is we're looking at the ways in which how the spending then affected student achievement, and tracing this out for the full universe of public school students, where I've gotten data for every public school student over a 15-year window, and I'm able to then look at those effects on student achievement. So I'm just going to highlight those and then stop to wrap up. Is that okay? So what I want you to kind of first see is that when we look at the earlier cohorts, that is of children that we are able to look at adult outcomes, my prior work showed that Head Start access, that is access to public pre-K, is really important. But if they subsequently go to poorly funded K-12 schools, the impacts fade out relatively quickly. But if they get that same Head Start access and they attend schools that are average resource, average per pupil spending, we see it translate into an 11 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school. We see that when they get this Head Start access, but they subsequently went to schools that were well-resourced, that is above 10% of per pupil spending, we see a 15 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school. And similarly, if we're looking at a 10 percentage point increase in per pupil spending, if it was preceded by, or it wasn't preceded by access to quality pre-K, we see that same 10% per pupil spending increase in K-12 results in about a 7 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school, which is good. But if it had been preceded by access to a quality pre-K program, those same low-income children experienced an 11 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school. Now, the point that I'm making is a lot of times people pit pre-K versus K-12, like as if you could do one and not both, or that there's not a synergy. That if you do the early pre-K, it allows children to be more school ready and be able to more take advantage of these learning opportunities in the K-12 period. What we try to document is, in these effects we saw not just on high school graduation, but wages, criminal involvement, poverty. I'm in the interest of time, I'm not going to say those things. But what I really want to highlight is that what we see is that for poor children, the long-run effects of K-12 spending, they double when preceded by access to quality pre-K. And the effects, the total effects are more than the sum of the parts. So if you do pre-K, it matters. If you do K-12 school resource equity, it matters. But if you do them in combination, and also if you think about doing them in integrated spaces, then those effects are way bigger than any one of those things in isolation. Now, all people talk about the cost. People are very enamored with but it costs. Yes, it costs. But what we really document is the targeted public investments in pre-K through 12 education and health investments, they more than pay for themselves. How? Communities spend less on remediation. They spend less on public assistance. They spend less on healthcare. They spend less on crime. They spend on criminal justice expenditures while benefiting from the increased tax revenues, having more productive adults. So it's not just from an equity lens, it's from an efficiency, and it's not just the moral document that our public investments have. So when I say that was then, is it now, let me just highlight quickly. $18 billion commitment over 8 years. California is the largest state system in the country. So 6.5 million children every year I'm able to analyze for more than a decade. And the key thing is they targeted the spending based on student level disadvantage, based on the proportion that were free and reduced price lunch, English language learners, homeless, foster youth, with a recognition that there was going to be a base grant of $8,000 per pupil, depending on grade level, and then a supplemental grant of $1,600 for each high-need student, again defined by these lower income, and a concentration grant to recognize concentrated poverty requires more investments above that. So $5,300 per high-need student in districts with greater than 55% high-need students. And what we see in the results is that when children experience that $1,000 per pupil spending increase for 3 consecutive years, so when they were, say, 7th grade, but they experienced a $1,000 increase when they were 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, that we saw their 7th grade achievement be a full grade level, be roughly 10 months of learning gains above what prior cohorts from their same school had experienced prior to the funding increases. I'm not talking about like a small increase. I'm talking about almost a full grade level difference in their math achievement that we're seeing across kids that experience this increase across the system of California. And we see similar 9 months of learning gains for reading achievement. Now, all I'm really trying to make the point is this translates into significant increases in the likelihood of graduating from high school. We saw a 5 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school in many of these very disadvantaged areas, and it led to significant improvements in college readiness. I'm talking about a 8 percentage point and 9.7 percentage point increase in college readiness that are hugely predictive of college success as measured by college GPAs and college graduation rates. So the investments we make today are preparing our kids for college success tomorrow. And if we don't make those decisions consciously, with intentionality, and recognizing pre-K is a part of that investment, then we're not doing right by our best selves. And our children represent our best selves. So let me close. And maybe it's worth saying, Kentucky should be also commended for their recent commitment to increase pre-K investments. Their state pre-K, this is for the whole country, but state pre-K investments have significantly increased in Kentucky in recent years, and that I think is an important part. In the interest of time, I won't discuss any more about other results that we show the pre-K investments in California interact with the K-12 investments in the same way that I have shown in my prior work. We find that 84 to 95% of the variation in school spending effectiveness was because of reductions in class size, increases in teacher salaries, reductions in teacher turnover, guidance counselors, health services. These are the three pieces that were the most essential aspects of translating the funding increases to measured improvements in student achievement. Teacher professional development is an additional component. So it's not just spending more, it's how you spend it, right? That made the difference, okay? So in sum, for poor children, long-run effects of K-12 spending double when preceded by access to quality pre-K. Resegregation of schools resulted in lower educational attainment for poor minority children, widened academic achievement gaps, and part of that was because many teachers that are some of our best teachers get burned out in highly concentrated poverty schools. They tend to transfer out, and it leaves in its vacuum many less experienced, less credentialed teachers in highly poverty and high need environments. We also see the recent surges in political polarization and racial intolerance in adulthood that we've witnessed. We document it's linked to the school age exposure to diversity or lack thereof, okay? We find these positive significant effects of K-12 spending increases. We find the effects for every grade, every subject, math and reading, and for every school in California that experienced this new infusion of state funds. We find that the impacts of achievement increase with the number of years of exposure to the new funding and how much the funding actually increased. Impacts on college readiness, high school graduation, and a significant narrowing of the achievement gap. So I only say this to say, are there big challenges? Undeniably. Is COVID an unprecedented challenge? Without doubt. The question for us today is, how do we respond? The federal investment in the COVID environment is an unprecedented investment in state and local communities. The question for us is, how do we leverage that investment so that it's not a one-time, but that we set a new normal, to set a new vision for what educational opportunity can look like on the other side of a pandemic. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for allowing me to share my work here. And I'm sorry. I think that when you care, and I always believe that people care not so much about how much you know until they know how much you care. So I just want you to know that I care about these issues deeply. I think that if you live and you work for research that can shine a light, you hope that at some point the light is not in your office. So, thank you. Okay, so I think it would be best to take questions, and I will just invite whomever to come to the podium. I'm not really sure what the format's supposed to be, but I'm open to whatever format you find most productive. Mostly, I want to listen, I want to hear, I want to contribute to the dialogue, so thank you.
Of course, the economist has to come up and break it, all right? And so, as part of your work, have you looked into the effect of enclaves and how across this nation there are sometimes school districts that are cut up by these enclaves? And here in Louisville, it's been one of those big issues, particularly because of busing that goes along with it, so that they've actually changed the districts up so many times that there are some schools that are literally close to you that you're not a reside school to anymore. So at times we're busing people way across town, and it's as if we're just moving their neighborhood to a school that's even further away. To what extent have we been studying some of those practices to see if there's better ways, more efficient ways of dealing with that? Because I can't imagine putting a kid on a bus for 2 hours and expecting them being okay is a good idea.
Yes, I thank you for that. I definitely think that we have to consider trade-offs that have to do with proximity, and also where we have different dimensions about even how we define diversity, not just along racial lines, not just along class or poverty-related lines, but also on language, right? On English language learners. That Louisville, for example, has experienced a significant increase in Hispanic students and in families from more immigrant community family. And so we have to think about how are the school systems and even the instruction around bilingual education, how have them be responsible to these changes. I think that's relevant. I think that when you think about student to school assignment policy, I guess what I would like to see is more attention to the teacher assignment issues. Like, I think we basically have the students as guinea pigs and don't have the resource equity established first. I don't think we should expect parents to find peace and assurance if we're not first kind of thinking about how are the teacher quality and the per pupil spending and the funding formula. So for example, the ESSA, the kind of reauthorization of the ESEA in 2016 mandated that every district report the school funding levels at the school level, so that intra-district resource allocation would be completely transparent and more accountability for how each district is allocating their teachers, their resources, their people spending in class studies, that could be measured at the school level. I think that kind of analysis is very paramount to kind of think about not the student to school assignment only. I know you asked about the student school assignment, but what I think is missing even more than that is how teachers are being assigned to ensure that principal leadership, if you assign some of your best principals to some of the more disadvantaged schools, I would offer they will attract a higher quality set of teaching workforce that feel like their teaching efforts are going to be supported. I think administrative leadership is part of that. But back to your question about the proximity, I would suggest that when parents don't have access to a car, what that lack of proximity means is less parental involvement, less parents at the parent-teacher conference, at the parent PTA meetings, less extracurricular activity for the child because they can't get the after school like here and there. Those are all things that affect student engagement. They don't just affect student absenteeism, but they affect all of those pieces. So is that a critical thing? Yes. I would just offer though, how we meet that need has to have some integration emphasis underneath it, because the existing housing structure is still very segregated. Not just in Louisville, unfortunately everywhere. And so that is just a condition. But I completely, great point. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. This is really important and interesting research. I'm a political scientist, so I loved your quote about democracy for the next generation, and this is the midwife. Education is the midwife.
I wish it was mine, but John Dewey, yes.
And so I had one informational question and then one strategic question. One is, I wonder if you have any of the data about the integration of teachers and how that are we seeing that integration in the teachers? And then the other question is about the money. Of course, it's about the money. And I would love to see more data and more beating the drum about how education is an investment in these payoffs. And you have some of them in your research. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so I will say one of the things that has accompanied the pandemic is a significant impact on teacher morale. I think the challenges that our public school teachers are experiencing are unprecedentedly more difficult than any other period. So the question about how we think about investing in teachers and doubling down on that investment, I feel like at the early part of the pandemic when people were having to homeschool, I have a 4th and 8th grader in public schools in Oakland, and all of us were like, oh Lord, these teachers, they are gifted. I teach in higher ed, that's a completely different gift set, you know? So we were all saying how appreciative we were of our local public school teachers in that first aftermath of the pandemic, first several months, but how quickly did all of that, wow, they need to be paid more, wow, they need to be, I feel like, I feel, maybe it's just in California, but it seems like that animation around how we better support teachers, like lost some significant steam in a time period where I think the teacher shortage, and particularly in particular like in math and science, I think we're so under producing relative to need. And I think that's also true about how we catalyze greater Black teachers in K-12 as well, and school leadership that is more diverse racial ethnically. So I guess what I would suggest is that there are ways to incentivize housing subsidies for housing affordability for teachers that are working in more disadvantaged communities. And there's ways we can incentivize and make and reward teaching in more difficult environments that I think could help. Because I think of like housing affordability and teacher quality, they're like thought of as like separate. They're the same issue actually. That a lot of the kind of pipeline into teaching is connected to not having housing affordability. And where teachers are teaching is also connected to those pieces. So I want to marry the housing affordability issues with the ways that we think about recruiting, retaining, and developing high quality teachers. Let me just remind you, not to remind you, but just remind us that 1 in 5 public school teachers leaves the profession in the first 5 years. In high poverty districts, 1 in 2 leave the profession on average in the first 5 years. That's just a very sobering reality that we have to kind of confront. So I'm not telling you I have all the solutions, but I can tell you they are they require a significant focus.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Your presentation was impeccable, actually. We understand many things from an economic perspective and also a socio-political perspective, but I'd like to lean on the side of mental health and well-being. Mm-hmm. And so I would like to know your perspective on how integration is for students who are placed into an environment where they are the only or one of few.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yes, so I do believe that, I began with belonging as an outcome, because belonging is about our identity, our sense of seeing purpose, and our sense of envisioning people that look like us pursuing a track, right? I'm an economist. I should just tell you that you don't need to be told. There's not that much racial ethnic diversity in my profession. I do think that for me, even as an economist, I was shaped in part by exposure to black economists that I saw doing the kind of work that inspired me to think, maybe I could use my skill set towards social justice. Not for inflation or macroeconomic policy, because that really didn't necessarily have the same resonance in my interest set, but I was seeing people like Sam Myers and William Doherty and other, I went to Morehouse, but part of me going to Morehouse as an undergrad was I was also wanting and appreciating that there is something about how your identity is nurtured when you aren't the only. So I would not suggest integration as antithetical to having an Afrocentric academy. I would not suggest integration as antithetical to having an all-women's high school or college for that matter. I'm not suggesting that like there aren't affinity environments of educational nurturing that are required, even if we're talking about women's underrepresentation in STEM. A big part of that is connected to what happens in college, and are they encouraged to pursue STEM careers even though they have the same achievement and often higher achievement than their male counterparts? What explains that? I believe identity and seeing people like you is a connected part of that. So I say that all to say the purpose of integration is so that the choice isn't a choice out of confinement. And too often, what we call school choice is really, for lower income families, a choice out of confinement. And black families are choosing Afrocentric academies sometimes because multicultural curriculums are not being fully embraced in predominantly white high schools, for example. I'm not talking about Louisville, I'm talking about in general. So I just think those are all parts of it, which is why I'm not saying there's a one-size-fits-all, but I do think that we have to be very thoughtful about holding up diversity as a principle and guiding way in which we think. Thanks for the good point.
I also went to Tuskegee.
I'm going to do a commercial for your book. I read this book.
By the way, this is the former dean of the law school, so when Dr. Rothstein speaks, we should definitely recognize who's speaking.
Well, my parents were school teachers, public school teachers in rural Kansas, so I did not grow up benefiting from the value of integration. But I did when I got to college, and I learned the value of having classmates who didn't look like me, who are from Kansas City, for goodness sake, from Topeka, Brown versus Board of Education. My father taught high school math. He was the one that taught algebra and trigonometry. And this has been an issue that's been so important to me for a long time. I've worked with Central High School, and our law students teach over there. And we are at a critical point in Louisville on our student assignment plan and these issues. And when I read your book, it was so wonderful about the data and connecting the pieces. And the one that I think is the most important, but perhaps the hardest to use to change policy or affect policy, is the connection that you showed that when you do these things, it affects, you don't have the remediation, you have the outcomes in the community. But you have JCPS saying, this is my budget. You have Metro Council saying, this is my budget. You have the criminal justice, this is my budget. And so it's so important to have those people talking to each other. And I just want to, if you have not read this book, it is very readable. I mean, economists, usually I get all lost in the data. But it is a remarkable book, and I thank you for the service, and especially for being here at this time.
Thank you. I'm very honored. Thank you.
Back. All right.
Okay. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
So I just wanted to ask, so like you were talking about the impacts of like integration for students, like later on, they vote for policy that furthers equity when they're exposed to integration. how would you suggest educating people from rural communities where the schools are probably like 94% white, like where I came from? How do you remedy that disparity?
So thank you for that. You know, I think rural communities in this country are experiencing underfunding, issues of inadequate access to quality health care. I can't say that the same prescription for how we kind of deal with interracial contact or how we deal with integration is certainly going to be of the same form or style, so I wouldn't ever suggest that. But I think of more about the commonality of how we think about constituencies being divided by their racial identity as opposed to their common needs from the state. So like I was asked to be an expert witness in a Pennsylvania school litigation case where Pennsylvania had been one of the most regressive funding systems in the country. And when you look at the data actually in Pennsylvania, for example, many of the rural communities are facing many of the same inadequate funding as the urban schools like Philadelphia. But because the racial, ethnic diversity of their constituents, they kind of don't see, they think the articulation of the debate sounds more like a zero-sum game, that for rural communities to get something, it has to somehow take away from the urban community, or vice versa. I think what I think would be more productive is a recognition of it's not rural versus urban. It's that they're both actually experiencing significant gaps where wealth per capita areas are fueling more access to resources, healthcare, education, and otherwise, and what can we do to kind of address that? So I don't know about the integration part because that's a little bit a more difficult thing with distance, but I would say that the school resource equity has significant parallels, including the public pre-K, because quality pre-K provision and access to quality pre-K is often more distant. And anybody who has young parents, or anybody who has young children knows that proximity to your 4-year-old is like everything.
Hi. I'll just talk loud. I have a loud voice. I just wanted to thank you so much for the research that you've done. Me and a couple of my friends are aspiring educators, and we're going to college to help integrate these changes, because growing up in integrated school systems, we have seen the importance of it on ourselves, and there's not a lot of adults, especially with all of the state's legislation that's being passed to not only like discourage equity and equality in schools, but literally stop it from happening in classrooms. I think that the research that you're doing is absolutely incredible, and as a future educator, I just want to thank you so much for the time and effort that you've spent in collecting these data and proving that it's worth it, and that it's not a zero gain, and that there's something to be found in equity for everyone, no matter who you are, and that's just going to tie us together. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that. May I ask, where did you grow up?
I grew up in just north of Indianapolis, in Indiana, and so we're actually like it's one of those like school districts where we're slowly working on it, and there's still performative activism, just. It happens, and we're working on it. But the change in diversity in my classrooms from kindergarten into high school was absolutely drastic, and it is absolutely phenomenal, and we're making big changes due to people who are doing research like you, so thank you so much.
Wonderful, great. And you're a junior here?
I'm a freshman.
Okay, all right. Very impressive, thank you for that. I'm just gonna look at the time just to make sure that. Okay, I see that it's 1:59, so I'm going to invite Dr. Valentine to maybe close us out and maybe tell us what the next steps are. But if this isn't the right time to close out, then you tell us whatever the next steps are. But I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, but I want to make sure I honor whatever your time was, whatever your original commitment was, and if you do have to leave, I want to just make sure Jeff has a chance to give his closing comments about the event and your, appreciation for my appreciation for you being here.
So you all ready for the closing? Here you go.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.